Yeah.
Okay, here's that we are running.
All right. When we left off last time, we had just finished, we're working with the profile index, and we had just finished off the discussion of number 6, the horizontal test. And your assignment was to look at the horizontal test, do it on our 2 horoscopes, and see what you come up with, at least for a one-line conspectus. So, let's look at Sigmund Freud. What I get for Sigmund Freud is 1/9. There's only 1 planet in the Eastern Hemisphere and 9 in the Western Hemisphere. And the one line that I put down into conspectus is almost all significant direct opportunities come through responding to others. So this is a life where the opportunities are not there to initiate things. You can only work in response or reaction to other people. Now this is probably the most clear and dramatic profile that we have seen so far. And it's only rarely that you'll find a 0-10 on this kind of a profile. Not only are the planets in the Western Hemisphere, but they're deep in the Western Hemisphere. In the 4th and the 9th house, there's only 1 planet, but they're all in that 6th and 7th area. And so that indicates this is very much a horoscope where the opportunities come through other people. And when that happens, when we see something like this brings up interesting questions. Because what we have is a conspectus that says this is what this is about, but what does it mean? And other questions come up. And this is why astrology is so fascinating, is because you're constantly having to ask yourself new questions. And so the question that came up to me is, do the opportunities come through others or through his awareness and responsiveness to others? Meaning to say, do they initiate the action, or is it just his sensitivity that's drawing in the information from the others? Now the answer to that question for me is the fact that if you look in the far west, we find all of the personal planets are there. There are some impersonal planets like Pluto and Uranus, but Sun, Venus, and Mercury are there, and that seems to indicate that it is most likely him in his awareness, and not that other people. Yes, he does have clients that come to him, but what it means in his life, because all of his personal planets are associated with other people, and personal planets are you in the way you're relating to the world, it indicates then that it's very likely that his success or the way he culminates transactions is in his knowledge or sensitivity to other people in himself. In fact, everything that he learned and everything that he put into psychoanalysis was from his patients. And his patients were not celebrities, and they were not authorities. He read and was aware of all the authorities in his time, but he worked more with ordinary people like you and I from everyday life. In fact, he was dedicated to other people, and he identified his whole being relative to other people. Only in the last 10 days of his life did he quit doing psychoanalysis, except for vacations. Otherwise, he was always doing it. And so all of the tenets of psychoanalysis were based on patients and working with them, experimenting with them, because the whole technique that he used in disburdening people of the things that were bothering them inwardly were things that developed over the course of 20, 30 years. So that psychoanalysis in the beginning started out with hypnotism, And in the end, it was almost as if he wasn't even there for the other person. The person couldn't see him or anything like that. There was no personal interaction at all. All right, when we look at the Carl Jung horoscope, we get a profile of 5 and 5, meaning to say that there are 5 Eastern planets and 5 Western planets. And so what I put down as my one-liner was balanced, but the Western planets are more deeply Western, and only Saturn is deeply in the East. And we see that by looking at the horoscope. He's got all of these planets very deep in the West, and only one that's deep in the East. I'm assuming everybody still has horoscopes yet. It's, again, a case that for Carl Jung, the Western planets are, again, the personal planets. Sun, Venus, Mercury are all there. And what is in the East is more impersonal. Saturn is definitely impersonal. And from this, I think it's possible to conclude that the opportunities through others affected him more personally, whereas opportunities that he initiated with other people, where he was the mover, like the East is, that those opportunities were, the relation with them was more impersonal, more objective to the people outside of himself, and not so, he wasn't as personally affected by them. Now, there is more balance in the Jung chart than there is in the Freud horoscope, but it is not clear that Jung was more aware and at ease with the world, especially his making a move in the world. Freud could travel a lot and he could make his way around in that, but in order to assert himself into society or into profession or the world at large, he was not real strong about that at all. Both Freud and Jung had a team, so to speak. They had a cadre of supporters, but Freud was much, much more dependent and relied on them to do the work that he was not strong about initializing. Now, what we're going through with doing all these tests and profiles is basically a recapitulation of what was done more thoroughly in the intermediate course that lasted 10 years. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but when we do, I want to look at it more psychologically and not just purely astrologically. All right, the next test is number 7, which is the quadrant test. Now, there are at least 3 ways, major ways, that you can get at the meaning of the quadrant test. And one way is to superimpose test number 5 and test number 6 onto each other, and that way you define 4 quadrants. And when you do that, the first quadrant, which begins with the first house, is a northeast quadrant. Being north, it's in the microcosmic little life sphere or hemisphere, and it's in the east at the same time. So that is looks like it is a focus on auto-initiated opportunities of a very personal nature. And so the second quadrant is the northwest quadrant, and it's still directed to the personal life, the little family things and such like that, but it is more oriented toward the others. And finally, we can look at the other 2. The third quadrant is south and west. It's about others, but it's in the larger world. And it's a impersonal world in some ways, but it's, cares about others. Looking at finally at the fourth quadrant, we find that that is the south and the east. And that, because it is in the southern hemisphere, it means more about society and the world at large. But it has more to do with how the individual, as a free agent in society, the kinds of opportunities that it has to affect society in a higher way. So the relationships, even though initiated by the individual, are not really highly personal. So there is something about this quadrant that when the sun is in it, the sun is rising. And the sun is an indicator of self, and just taking it as a direct symbol from nature, this is where the individual is initiating activities in order to climb to the ultimate heights of society or profession or things like that, recognition. All right. Now, a second way that we can look at the quadrants is by looking at them as bounded regions. We did a whole bunch of that in the aspects course, saying that each quadrant is a region that is bounded by the hemisphere or the north-south line. And a bounded region, if you get into the heart of it, it is when the character of that bounded region is most defined. Like if we take the northern hemisphere, the fourth house is as deep as you can go into the northern hemisphere, and that is a withdrawal into the personal life or the home life or into great subjectivity. So if we start applying that kind of thinking to the quadrants, the heart of the first quadrant is the second house. And the second house is personal needs. And so you can see then that the first quadrant is a personal needs quadrant. Personal needs, physical body itself, what it needs to stay alive, the income that you need to stay alive, and then the very basic skills, social skills that you need to operate at all is what the third quadrant is all about. Now the second quadrant, the heart of that is in the fifth house. And the fifth house is the house of expression or of giving forth. And probably the best giving forth is the giving forth of children. So the second quadrant is still in the north, and so it is still personal. It's your microcosmic little life, but it is for giving forth. So the second, in the same way the first quadrant could be called personal needs, the second quadrant could be called personal expression. Then if you go up to the third quadrant, its heart is in the eighth house, and the eighth house is shared needs. That's the kitty. That's the taxes that get taken, and then those taxes pay for the way the streets work or social welfare works, all of those things like that. So you can see then that the upper hemisphere is societally oriented. It's macrocosmically oriented and not microcosmically oriented. And so this would then be the shared needs quadrant. And finally, the heart of the fourth quadrant is the 11th house. And when we're talking about the 11th house in this way, we're not talking only about friendship, but mostly about impersonal associations, associates, things that you have to deal with people from other cultures, things like that. So in the same way that we would say that we would do anything for the sake of friendship, the 11th house is anything that we would do for its own sake. Art for the sake of art. Goodness for the sake of goodness. Those are all the kinds of opportunities that come from the 11th house. So we can see that this is a kind of giving. And that kind of giving is, because it's in the southern hemisphere, it is shared giving. It's a societal giving. All right. So there are other ways that we can look at these, at the quadrants and come up with different meanings for them and different sets of keywords. We're going to have, at the end, we'll have a whole bunch of things that in a handout. So we'll make it easy. All right. Looking at the Sigmund Freud horoscope, we get 0 in expressional houses, 4 in professional houses, 5 in interhuman interaction houses. Oh no, we're looking at the quadrants here. All right, 0 in the first quadrant, 4 in the second quadrant, 5 in the third quadrant, and 1 in the fourth quadrant. And that's exactly what you expect if you're using an overlay. The conspectus line that I wrote, generous in sharing and very culturally aware. This is still a very broad test. The things that we're looking at now are broad and the emphasis is faint, except if we have a standout one like we did with the East-West test. But for the most part, we're looking at something that's pretty mild. He didn't, with nothing in the first quadrant, he didn't focus a whole lot on personal needs. When he was poor, he had to, but for the most part, he was more interested and engaged in the care for other people than he was for his own personal needs. He was very much a generous man. He was a second quadrant man in terms of giving because he was generous to a fault, but there was not a fault. I don't know how to say it. If his children asked anything from him, he gave it to them. And he gave them more than ever what they asked for. And if you would say that that's generosity to a fault, you would think that it would have a bad effect. But it did not have a bad effect. The reason that, because none of his children was spoiled. Not at all. And so you can see that this shows that this is accurate. A big focus is on shared expression, especially with his children. There's a lot in the third quadrant, and he was keenly aware of cultural things. In fact, he was a collector of ancient artifacts. In fact, he was even superstitious, though. He collected all these little figurines from ancient Greece that were lovely little mini pieces of sculpture, and he collected them and he had them on a table in his office. And even when he was forced to move to England, escaping the Nazis, he had them on his office. But when I believe it was his daughter was about to be captured by the Nazis, he broke one of them, superstitiously believing that he was making a sacrifice of something that was dear to him. And this is the man that claimed, he had the superstitions, but he claimed not to believe in that sort of thing. But when it came down to it, love will make you do very funny things.
Did he save her?
What?
Did she get saved?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, she was to Sigmund Freud what Emma was to Carl Jung. Carried on the work after he was an active agent in the work. All right. If we look at the Jung chart, we get 4 in the first quadrant, and 2 in the second quadrant, 3 in the third quadrant, and only 1 in the fourth quadrant. Now, even though there's only 1 in the fourth quadrant, you have to be careful how you read these, because there's probably as much balance as there is imbalance. a perfect balance would be a 3-3-2-2 in some order or another. But in this case, only two are out of that being a 2 or a 3, the first and the last. So, whether you interpret that as an imbalance, it's not very much the case. The first quadrant would, in his case, does not seem to be a preoccupation with income. In fact, if you look in detail, if you look at the heart of the first quadrant, you find Neptune in the second house. And for him, possessions or personal needs were much more of a spiritual nature. Clearly, if you look at the third house, he had a massive library, probably a library that would fill everything in all of these rooms, and it was constantly shuffling new things in and out. And then he had Bollingen, which was his little island retreat that he built. All right. Trying to move on real quickly through this because I want to get all done with all of this, including the cross-profiling, by the end of the semester so that we can start digging into deeper and more challenging and exciting things as we go. Again, if you want recordings and if you want information from when this is covered more thoroughly rather than just in a recap, that I have that available. I'll very gladly share that with you. All right, test number 8. Test number 8 is the circumstantiality test. That is very faint. Very rare that much comes out of the circumstantiality test. The idea is that the odd number houses represent, for all humanity over all time, represent something that is more changeable, where you're not a victim of circumstance as much as you are a victim of circumstance in the even number houses. And if somebody does have a lot of planets in even houses, it becomes a matter of learning to accept things in life, or in the case of Sigmund Freud, it's accepting that everything was deterministic as much as possible, which he couldn't really do. You have to interpret these things differently for different people. Suppose you're a peasant and you're something like a tenant farmer or something like that. You might feel the pinch of circumstantial opportunities, but that wouldn't be an intellectual matter. Whereas if you are someone who is trying to be free from everything that controls us in society, the circumstances that you can't change, things that you can't change, are irksome. This is one that's in my consciousness to some extent. With aging, I can see the physiological effects of aging and I can be keenly aware of them, but I can't do anything about it. And I don't want to be accepting and welcome death in the door, but when it comes, I'll take it. So it is something that the interpretation varies according to whom you are directing it. All right. If we look at Freud, we get a 5-5, and there's nothing much that can be said about that. It's balance. Again, balance is the healthiest thing. Everything in the physical body depends on balance. There are dozens of balances that are crucial in our physiology, and those balances, as long as they're kept, we don't have any ill conditions. But let them get out of balance and we know right away. Only interesting thing, but it's very faint and I don't have really much that I could say about it, is that in the Freud chart he has negative signs on the odd houses and positive signs on the even houses. So there might be some little bit of discomfort with the world at large. In fact, anytime you have that much in the West, you're often displeased or uncomfortable with your external personal circumstances in the first place, and having this kind of a setup as well would increase that discomfort. All right, in the horoscope of Carl Jung, we get 6 in the odd number houses and 4 in the even number houses. That's by far more balanced than it is unbalanced. And so there's not a whole lot we can say. However, if you look at things, you can always ask questions. And it causes me to wonder whether, whether the circumstances of his life caused him to be brought into a Christian life. But I don't want to go into that. I guess that's too much. By the way, you can't tell religion from a horoscope. You can tell whether somebody will have a new outlook about religion, but you can't tell whether somebody's going to be a Catholic or something like that. All right. Freud had interesting things to say about religion, just in passing. He thought that psychoanalysis could only have been discovered by a atheistic Jew, because everybody else would have so many religious things at stake that they wouldn't see things, or they would be front-loaded to see things in a particular way. All right.
Well, if they had a lot of children, wouldn't they be Catholic?
Not necessarily. Freud had about 5 children.
But wouldn't Judaism figure in?
What?
Judaism. He's a Jew.
Yeah, but he considered that a culture, not a religion.
Okay.
He liked the cultural part of it, but he thought all the rest he thought was superstition.
He didn't go to temple.
No, he did not. And if there were social functions, he might have gone or something like that. He did at times go to temple and give talks, because they asked talks from him. But his whole take on religion, because it has repeated observances. Now, mind you, this comes from somebody who is an atheist materialist. He saw in people who were religious the same thing that he found in obsessional neurotics. And so he thought that all of the people in the world that had religious beliefs were basically neurotic, and they were working out the same kind of thing that obsessional neurotic, meaning to say that he thought it had to do with a throwback to the early development of human society in general, or human culture in general, because he could trace back obsessional neurosis in an individual. He could trace back to something a stage that was not fulfilled in their very early childhood, that they never fulfilled it, and they still keep trying to fulfill it now. And then the reason they couldn't fulfill it is because they had something that repressed it, and it was repressed by part of the socialization process and the growth in moral development and things like that. That's the way he saw the whole world in terms like that. And with believing what he believed and not being sensitive to spiritual things, everything that he said was logical. This is the thing. This is the Taurus. And when you get in his bull ring, if you accept his first principles, you have to come to the same conclusions that he does, because it is very logically and in an orderly way it comes to the conclusion that he came to. All right. Now, the way this thing is set up, the profile index, is that we have the attitudes, the opportunities, and the action, and the focus. Now, in general, the further down the sheet you get, the more important or the more significant they are. That means to say that the opportunity profiles are more important than the attitude profiles, and the action profiles are more important than either the opportunity or the attitude. The focus doesn't fit in. It's just something else that has to be gone into, but it doesn't fit into that same structure. Now, the same thing happens if you're within one of the categories. Like right now, we are in the opportunities category. And the further you go into the opportunities category, the more significant it is. So that the last two tests and profiles that we're going to look at, the angularity and the triplicity, that they're much more significant than the circumstantiality or the quadrants or anything that came before them. So, in order of relative significance, the lowest significance is usually signs. Then come the houses, and then come the planets, but the planets we're using as the markers to determine what the profile is, and then the most significant thing is the aspects. All right. Trying to understand opportunity profiles when we come to understanding the angularity. When we're looking at angularity, we're looking at the first, the fourth, the 7th, and the 10th as being angular. The 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th are called succedent houses. And the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th are called cadent houses. And we want to understand them. And we can't understand them as bounded regions as we did before, because we'd have to get into the center of a house and how the center of a house describes the whole house, and we can't do that. And we can't do an overlay like we did with the quadrants. So the only way that we can get at understanding these kinds of tests and profiles is as seeing the houses as being derivative from the signs. So analogously, what is in the houses as attitudes comes out as opportunities. So the way this is set up on this mandala, the first house is lined up with the first sign. And that's what we want to be able to get to. The angular houses relate to the cardinal signs. And the word cardinal in this grammatical usage means of the most basic importance. And when we're talking about astrology, we're talking about a map or a clock of destiny. This means then that the cardinal signs are about the most base or basic destiny. And that works out well, because going all the way back into ancient India, the principle of cause and consequence, which is the basis of destiny, is sometimes called the principle of action. You take an action and it produces a reaction. Now, when we look at the cardinal signs, this holds together very well, because all of the cardinal signs have attitudes of action. Now, if we analogize this to the angular houses, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th, are they the most basic kind of opportunities? The answer is yes, but it requires a little bit of qualification and understanding. The way it works is that the angular houses are basic to the structure of opportunities. We're here as human beings, we're focused in the chemical region of the physical world, and our vehicle for relating to this physical realm is our dense physical body. And that is ruled by the first house. So the ability to relate to this world at all is indicated by the first house. And that's about as basic in terms of opportunities as you can get. So that's one way of understanding it. Now, we're not alone here. We interact with others. And the ability to interact with anyone, whether that is a friend or a foe or somebody who is, how would you say it? Somebody that is a partner or a rival, that situation is indicated by the first and the seventh house. It is me and you, or you and I, how you're looking at it. So we can see then that the first and seventh house represent the basic interaction with relating to anyone at all. And that's what the horizontal relationships mean. However, things do not always stay on the level. Some things push us down or pull us up. In order to be pushed down or pulled up, there has to be an influence from above. And then that basic structure of something being above the level on which we are going is what the 10th house is all about. Whereas if we are drawn or pulled down by our own subjectivity to things that we are not aware of, in fact, the things of our personal life, that is what the nadir or the fourth house cusp is like. So from this we can see that the angular houses, the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th, represent the basic relational structure. Now, the succeedent houses are the 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th. When we look at the fixed signs, the fixed signs are the responsibilities that accrue to taking action. Anytime you act, you draw responsibility or you draw things to you. It's a basic law of physics that if there is a vector, it forms an attractive field around it. And so the 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th represent responsibility houses. And responsibilities stay there. And so there is something about the succeedent houses that is sustaining. A responsibility doesn't go away until it's taken care of. And so there is something of a stabilizing effect to the experiences that come from the succeedent houses. But you do stick with them until you finish. And when you finish, you are free. So that if you look at the 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th, those are houses of freedom. The 2nd house is financial freedom. The 5th house is freedom of expression. You know that you can say whatever you want to say because you have the opportunities to have built a talent to do that. And the 8th house is freedom from things, so that you are away from the necessity. And finally, the 11th house is pure freedom. You can be yourself however you want to be with your friends. Or if something is utopian, you're completely free. So and freedom in this sense is a talent. It's a talent at anything in life you can master. Now, that leaves us with the cadent houses. Now we can see that the cardinal and the fixed, or the angular and the succeedent houses, represent learning by experience. But that's not the only way to learn. We can learn by imitating others. We can learn by watching others' experiences, or we can theorize or do things like that. Those are all the qualities of the common signs. So the cadent houses, which are abstractions or derivatives from the common signs, represent opportunities to learn indirectly. The third house, you learn by reading about it. I had that experience when I went to South America. I read a lot of information before going to South America, and when I would be talking to friends in South America, I knew things that they didn't know because they hadn't read about them, because they lived there and they took it for granted. The sixth, to develop a method, and that by putting your method together, you don't have to, the method takes care of it all, and the system takes care of it all. And the ninth house is theory. If you have the general idea, or if you have the principle of it, you can work out any detail. The 12th house represents complete seeing it away from other people. I don't know how to say it any other way. Like in Christianity, the idea of atonement for our deviant nature is attained through Christ. And that's not something easily understood, and most understandings of it are pretty shallow, but I don't want to go into it because it's way too long. And it's called the doctrine of vicarious atonement. And the 12th house is that. You're atoning for something you're not even aware of. Maybe it was done in a past life, or it's part of a social error or something like that, and you go through that kind of experience. All right, so there's only one way to look at the angularity test, which is number 9. And that is by seeing it as derivative. Now, we'll have keywords here in just a little bit for you to start applying to all your horoscopes at home. All right, applying it to the Sigmund Freud, we get 4, 4, 2. 4 angular, 4 succeedent, and 2 cadent. 4, 3, 3 would be a perfect balance, but 2 of them are off 1. That's, Now, Freud read a lot of literature, and it was all mostly technical or the artistic literature of his time. He was, of German writing authors, he was friends with almost all the great writers of his time. Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse. He was familiar on a first-name basis with all of them. When he cited a lot of technical literature every time he wrote to back up what he did. But that's not how he got his information. He got his information through direct experience. So this 442 profile shows that by having basic relational structure, and he went very much not only in the Oedipal complex, but in the whole of family structure, he went very, very deeply into that. And he had responsibilities. And so that is, this describes his life accurately. All right. Now, if we look at the attitude tests, we didn't look at the Jung chart. With Jung, we get a perfect balance. We get a 3-3-4, which is as balanced as you can get. And there were more opportunities for indirect experience, but not enough so that you could say that that was really important. Both Freud and Jung were voluminous readers. I believe that Jung read much more than Freud, but what he read was much different. He did not read fiction the way that Freud did, Jung did not. And he did not read as much of psychological technical literature, just the most important papers and the ones that were, precedent setting in the history of psychology. What he preferred to do instead was to read original source material from culture. Like he read a lot of alchemy, and he read a lot of Gnosticism, and he read astrology, and he read the I Ching and things like that. And that is where he put his attention. So he did have more opportunities for vicarious things, and he did take more flights of fantasy. When he tried to apply his psychology to culture, he was much bolder and much more adventurous in that than Freud was. All right. Now let's get down to the last test that we're going to do, and that is the triplicity test. Now we'll go back to the signs versus the houses again. If we look at the signs, we see there's a big difference between the cardinal signs and the 4 elements. And that difference is qualitative. Like the cardinal signs are active. But you're saying much more if you say a person is fiery than if you're saying that person is active. Because with fiery, you have a qualitative, you have a feel for something there that you don't get from just the attribute test. Now, both designations are valuable, and both of them are helpful. Now, this distinction between the attributes and the elements carries into the distinction between the angles and the triplicities. The triplicities are much more specific, and they're much more useful. They're not just talking about the structure of relationship in 4 directions of space. What they're talking about is the something that is more applied to the world. So the angularity test is about opportunity structure, and the triplicity test is about the opportunities and the qualities of opportunities in life. Now, the 4 triplicities are about opportunities that apply to major things, major divisions in life. The 1st, the 5th, and the 9th is education. The 1st house is on the job training, the 5th house is general education, and the 9th house is scholarly education. But there are also signs of expression. How you express yourself in your person and in your dress is the 1st house, and how you express yourself in art or any singing a song or something like that is the 5th house, and how you express yourself in relation to the divine is what the 9th house is. So there are also houses of entertainment. Your own entertainment with the 1st house, and the 5th house is just playing all together, and the 9th house is, I don't know how to say it, transcendent entertainment. You can do the same thing with the 2nd, the 6th, and the 10th. They are all houses that have to do with our work life. The 2nd house being materials that we work with, or the capital that we need, or the income that we derive, or the ability to evaluate things in a material sense. And the 6th house is the people you work with, the working conditions, the techniques that you need. It's all about labor. And in the grand economic triad, the 10th house is about management. It is how the balance of time versus material or labor versus material is managed from above. And it is how one distinguishes oneself in the world as a professional. The second house is something more like grunt labor, and the sixth house is more like having a trade, and the 10th house is more like having a full-fledged profession. The 3rd, the 7th, and the 11th are houses for opportunities to relate to other people as equals, not necessarily as father-son or master-slave, but as equals. The 3rd house is brothers and sisters. You're all under the same parents, and you have a certain equality in that. The thing about the 3rd house is you can't change it very easily. You can't make your brother not be your brother. The 7th house is equal interactions, but taken on voluntarily. Like you choose to marry, or you choose to have somebody as an enemy, or you choose to join a team or a band or something like that. And then the 11th house is just freedom to associate with anybody and to have no strings attached in any way in the equality. And the final grouping, the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th, has to do with things unconscious in ourselves. Like the 4th house is personal hang-ups or habits or things that we carry about in our subconscious if we don't do retrospection. And the 8th house is things that ways that we get in touch with what is in us. Most people don't get in touch with the invisible worlds of the unconscious until they die. If we do spiritual exercises, we can go through the little death and actually live in the land of the dead and then come back here. The 12th house is relating to the spiritual worlds in a super conscious way. It's relating to the world of the gods and things like that. And there are other designations, but we've gone into them before, and I don't want to be too redundant on all of these things. So we're talking here about things of 4 major divisions in life of opportunities that come to us. One being more educational or expressive, one being more professional or work-oriented, one being more related to others as friends and equals, and one as solving problems, personal problems, shared problems, or universal problems. All right, if we do this test on Sigmund Freud, we get a 1, 2, 4, 3. That is, he has only one expressive planet, which fortunately is Jupiter, so he can outpour. He has only 2 work planets, Venus and Pluto, and he has 4 planets in relating to other people, meaning to say that this is somebody who is more fulfilled, and it is more important for him to act within character by relating to other people. And in doing that is where the success of his life is. So this is all, astrology sees things altogether differently than the world does. If you meet somebody new, you go to a party and somebody says, well, what do you do? And Sigmund Freud says, well, my wife and I share a lot. And you'd say, well, but what do you do? Well, we sing together and we have raised a wonderful family together, and the person would begin frustrated and they say, what do you do? The world thinks that the 2nd, the 6th, and the 10th house is everything. For Sigmund Freud, that wasn't the case. He was a professional, but that was never really important to him that he was a professional. He was a doctor. He went into that because there's no other way to become a doctor in order to get married to the woman that he loved. And he had a painfully long courtship, and he really loved her very, very deeply. And I don't think they ever had a fight between the two of them. And his relationships, even with his sister-in-law, his wife didn't travel well, so he traveled every year with his sister-in-law. They went all over Europe. And that friendship was, People try to make it that it was something naughty or something like that. There wasn't anything like it. Freud was a prude for a man who wrote a lot about the function of sex in life and how important it is in our psychological development. He was not a sex monger at all. He thought that if you had these characteristics in you, that they should have expression, provided that they are not detrimental to society. In fact, he thought that all of our psychological problems were a result of not being able to fulfill basic drives and needs that we have because of socialization and refinements in culture. He only on very rare occasions would he tell naughty jokes. And then they would have to be something that had more wit to them than they had sexuality, because he didn't think they were funny, because he knew what happened with people that have all those kinds of ambivalences or restraints about it. So this profile shows him to be more in the activity of relating to people as the most important if he's living in harmony with himself. The second most important thing is dealing with the unconscious, dealing with the other world. And so this describes him quite well. It's not greatly out of balance. Again, the standard would be 3-3-2-2, and he's got a 3 and a 2. It's just a 1 and a 4, a little bit off a little bit. Now, interesting is that he wrote a lot, but he was not an expressive writer. You did not get the feel of Freud when you read him. And I've read thousands of pages by now of him. I have only one more major work, and then I've read all the major works by him. But he was very much a communicator. So he was not a professional man, didn't consider himself a professional man, but his people were important to him, especially his friends. He had one friend named Fleiss, and Fleiss influenced and was almost responsible for the whole early part of the theoretical part of psychoanalysis. So he never took an authoritative stance. He did not play doctor. He wanted to be invisible to his clients, and he treated them as partners, and they worked out their timings and what they did together. He saw that the whole process of transference and giving things back and forth between patient and therapist, he saw that as a team activity. All right. If we look at the same triplicity test with Carl Jung, we get a 1, 3, 5, 1. Again, not highly expressive, but the expressiveness that he does have is generous. And I think in this case, the attitude of Leo comes in with the expressiveness and to a certain extent overrides the opportunities. Now, I'm not completely understanding of this profile at all. This is one of those things that you run into something and it isn't obvious, and sometimes you have to think on it for a long time, and sometimes you come to an understanding of it, and sometimes you don't. I had one this week. I worked with somebody last week that was working on a self-esteem issue, and we worked together for about 45 minutes or something like that, and I said, you have other issues you want to talk about, we'll get back to it again. And then 2 days later it came to me, or 3 days later it came to me, that's what that meant. So I had to call a person up and say, hey, this is what you're looking for. And this is the thing about a horoscope, you're not going to get it all right away. And I'm not sure I understand this at all. Saturn is the only planet that is in the first, the fifth, and the ninth. That almost makes it a zero category. But despite that, his work spans many, many volumes. And I assume from this that it was because of his desire to share that his desire to share is where all of voluminous writings came from. The third house has 2 planets in it, and that's part of that relational activity. In fact, there's some interesting things in here. We got 5 minutes yet that we can fill here yet. Carl Jung had 2 brothers and a sister, but both of the brothers died in infancy. They were both older than him, so he never knew them. And this is one of those questions again. If we look at Pluto in the 3rd house, in an exact quincunx to Jupiter, and that yods Mars in Sagittarius, and I just wonder whether there isn't something here that it took 3 tries before he got here and got into the body at all altogether. I don't have experience with that one. I've worked before with Salvador Dali and Salvador Dali's brother, Salvador Guido Dali, and there it's clear to see that there was a relationship between his brother being him at a first try. This one is not clear. It's also interesting to note that his sister, he has the moon in the 3rd house, and it's square to Uranus, and Neptune is on the cusp of the 3rd house, and it's square to Neptune. And Carl Jung comes from a family on his mother's side that is highly mediumistic. And with his sister, when they were children, the sister's older than him, when they were children, they used to sit in seances together. And so that describes this pretty well. It shows partnership, and it shows partnership, though that has difficulty with meshing things spiritually. So what we're looking at then is 5 planets again in the relational houses, and the interactions with people are therefore most important. Now both Freud and Jung had Mars in the 11th house and the Sun in the 7th house. For Freud it meant more influential friendships, but it wasn't so for Carl Jung. Carl Jung's friends were more intellectual associates, and they sort of danced around things, but it wasn't intimate the way it was, and there was not a lot of allowed influence with him and his friends. So it's interesting. As far as 3rd house is concerned, there were a lot of interactions when he was in elementary school with students, and he was sort of an outcast, but he was strong enough to beat them up if things got too bad. All right, I don't want to go any further than this. Next time, let's go ahead and try to do all of the activity profiles. We'll discuss the profiles, what they mean, very briefly, and there will be a handout again so that I don't have to say it all, go through that long, tedious thing a second time. And then we'll do all of the tests. And then the following time we'll look at the focus tests, and then we have one more after that, and that's when we'll do all of the cross-profiling and give you assignments for over summer and things like that. You look different. Oh, these are the handouts.
You tick off a number of planets here, a number of planets there, but Which planet?
No, not when we're looking at this. We're looking at the broad outline.
Okay.
The which planets, that comes later on when we get into a detailed analysis.
And then I did notice, like you said, Mars, the Sun, and even Venus
Yeah,
are in the exact same,
yeah,
well, the same houses,
Yeah.
I'm not exact.
yes. Well, they were both exceedingly caring with their patients. And Jung drifted a little bit and brought in a different kind of caring. But
They both had Sun Uranus in the 7th. That's
Yeah.
interesting, and Mars in the 11th.
yeah,
Other than that.
oh, thank you.
I'm still trying to download those things. I think I downloaded them, but that only time will show.